Thank you for joining the discussion today. We invited different people working in the industry to bring a global view and also a national and city strategy, but also an approach on building levels to help us understand what's behind the terms of circular cities, what the different countries and cities do to become more circular, and if and how systemic thinking on urban scale could bring us closer to the circular cities approach. So this is the problem we want to explore with this great panelists shown here. We have Sophie from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. We have Kelly Rowe from Prink and also from the African Circular Economy Network. Stephanie Leroy from Paris, from CITEC. Then Cornelia Dinker from the Smart City and Sustainable Amsterdam, and Anders Bankertsner from Nana Architects. Welcome to the panelists. We would start with Sophie giving a short presentation about what the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is doing and what her work is focusing on. So over to you, Sophie.
Okay, so my name is Sophie and I'm currently a policy analyst at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. I'm actually pretty new in this role. Previously, I was working in the fashion initiative also within the foundation for the past year and a half, but have now made this transition to our policy and institutions team. So moving from a focus that was primarily on fashion and textile businesses to now covering our relationships with global institutions. We also have previous work on cities, which is what I'm going to talk to you about today. So briefly, I'm going to introduce EMF and what we do, as well as the principles of the circular economy as we see them. Then I'll cover why cities should engage in the transition to a circular economy, as well as potential opportunities that they can benefit from in this transition. And finally, give you one example of a city practicing these circular economy principles, which is the City of London. So today, this is very much how we frame everything at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. We say that we live in a take, make, waste linear economy, whereby we take materials and resources from the earth, we make them into products which are ultimately used for a very short amount of time and end up as waste, either through landfill, incineration, or uncontrolled leakage into the environment. And this is why we advocate for a circular economy, which is based on 3 principles, all driven by design. And these are eliminate waste and pollution, circulate the products and materials, and regenerate nature. So this is very briefly EMF's spiel on what circular economy is. And as a foundation, we want to help businesses and policymakers and governments accelerate this transition by identifying key gaps and levers that they can use to tackle the challenges that they're facing. So why cities? I think that Kitty and Annika introduced this, but just to go over it a little bit more again, cities cover approximately 85% of our global GDP, consume 75% of our resources, and generate between 60 and 85% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and at the same time are responsible for 50% of our global solid waste production. In addition to this, in our current linear economy, they bring together finance, innovation, knowledge, and networks. So as a result of this, cities have a crucial role in creating and enabling the conditions we need for a circular economy to emerge and thrive. Urban decision makers can develop ambitious policies, including strategies and roadmaps or demonstration projects, and involve lots of other city actors to drive this change. And finally, cities will also need to try new things together to pioneer new collaborations that could potentially reimagine how we as consumers produce and manage our materials and resources. So we talked to Annika and Kitty briefly talked about, like, we're going to be discussing what is a circular city, what makes a circular city, and a brief definition of one is a city that promotes the transition in an integrated way across all of its functions. So this means in collaboration with their citizens, businesses, as well as the research community. And it also means that in practice, they foster business models and economic behavior, which will ultimately decouple resource use from economic activity. And the city will do this by maintaining the value of products and components for as long as possible. So that's really relating to the circulate products principle that I was referring to in the 3 principles in the circular economy. And we'll also aim for these products or services to minimize harmful resource use and waste generation as well. And through this transition process, cities that are aiming to be circular will also seek to improve human well-being overall, reduce their emissions, protect and enhance their biodiversity, as well as promote social justice. And this is all in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. So what are some of the opportunities for cities if they choose to engage in this transition to a circular economy? Well, a few of the examples I'm going to cover revolve around the built environment because of our host today, the Hapoel Foundation. So 4 key benefits that we've outlined that could be achieved through circular economy development path include reducing the overall need for new construction, improving urban land use, reducing construction and operational costs, and also increasing resource efficiency, whilst at the same time strengthening the local economy. An example of a city that has put this into practice is in Brazil, where 30 years ago, they used mixed-use development and densification along 5 key transport corridors that were served by a robust rapid transit system. And the benefits that resulted from this plan were that they had improved urban land use, increased public transport use by the citizens, and this also resulted in a reduced demand for the private transport fuel. And so this has resulted today, 30 years on, in the city having some of the lowest congestion and transport costs in Brazil, which cover approximately 10% of their overall income. Now, this is just one example, but we have many more from our research and case studies that we've done as part of our work at the foundation, and that can all be discovered on our website. But onto a few other opportunities from the perspective of circular business models. One of our papers in collaboration with Arup highlighted a few circular business models that they found offered better returns than business as usual real estate business models. And these include designing in flexible spaces for buildings, that they have multi-use for underutilized spaces. Also included creating buildings that are resilient to both changing market conditions and social expectations by building them in a way that they will be able to be adaptable to alternative uses. The third is relocatable buildings, where they are designed in a modular and deconstructible way with the intention that they can be moved across sites for temporary use. And the final is residual value, which is essentially designing the building in a way that the value of the materials will be retained over its lifetime. Oops, sorry. Go back. So that when it reaches its deconstruction phase, these materials can be used again for new things. So finally, an example from the City of London. They have released their circular economy statements, which is a world first requirement for all of their large scale developments to incorporate a circular economy statement in the planning submission phase. So this includes all buildings being more like designed basically to be more easily dismantled or changed and adapted for a different use over their lifetime. And it also, as I was mentioning before, about treating the materials as valuable over the lifetime of the buildings as key resources rather than waste. And this circular economy statement also would then prioritize the retention of existing structures above demolition, where this could be the more sustainable and appropriate approach. This is, again, just one example of a city engaging in the transition to a circular economy. And we have loads of case studies from cities around the world on our city's webpage. We also have papers on urban policy levers that we've identified of how policymakers can engage in terms of helping the city reach that transition through key measures that involve fiscal measures, that involve public procurement and urban planning as well. So thank you. I'll pass back to our hosts.
Thank you very much, Sophie. That was very interesting. And I think as the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is like the leading foundation in the whole field, it's very good to have you on board and to hear about your work in the industry. We would have one direct question afterwards, because you've been telling that I think you worked in the fashion side of things earlier, so more on the business side, and now switch to the more policy focus and more circular economy and circular cities. Do you feel like both sectors are aiming for the same goals? So the private sector, but also the public sector?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the public sector really plays a role in creating the enabling conditions in the space, whether that's in cities, whether it's on a more national or global level, whereas the businesses themselves can work towards circular economy goals within their business, but they really struggle when there's not that wider enabling system, because we do live in a linear system. And I think lots of businesses are struggling to take that systems thinking approach and be able to implement their circular solutions in this linear system. It's just not working. So we need the two in collaboration together.
Thank you very much. We would then go over to Kelly. Kelly Rowe is an innovation lead at Brink. They are tackling complex challenges using the circular economy. She's also a chapter member of the African Circular Economy Network, which is a non-profit company that promotes a restorative and inclusive African economy. And I would pass over to Kelly.
Thanks, team. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I'm very excited about this collective wisdom. I feel like if we were just to unload all the knowledge and experiences that we have here, we could probably write a couple of books and really like activate a lot more change in the world. And I'm very honored to be here. And thanks so much, Kitty and Anika and Andrew for bringing me into this. Sophie, I was really inspired by the points that you're making, and I quickly realized that some of the things you were saying, I was like, let's not repeat those things. And thank you for covering the fundamentals of working towards circular futures for cities. I guess what I'd like to be doing with us today is just really getting us to start thinking a little bit more about what inclusive economies actually look like, and in thinking about how that shapes up the conversation in urban development spaces. And I'm not an urban development specialist at all. My role kind of intersects more with livelihood systems and thinking about how do we create these future economies, but that bring people into the mix. And so I'll be exploring a little bit of that with you today. And I'd love to hear your thoughts as I go along. We know that there's a lot happening across the globe, and EMF just yesterday shared another example in London. In Hackney, I don't know if you know Hackney at all. It's in east of London. I was there about 2 weeks ago, freezing. And I was really just inspired by what was taking place. I can see that there's a lot of activity. And one initiative that they've got kind of like shaping up, moving into the community space, is a library, and thinking about how do we make tools more accessible to the community, where we don't need to continuously drive these linear models of consumption. So we don't all need to own a drill or a hammer in our homes. We quite easily have the ability to tap into a community collective that's available to us at that level. So if you want to learn a little bit more about that, it's on their LinkedIn feed. It's a beautiful little video that you can watch. What really then got me thinking a bit further from that is in thinking about what are the potential opportunities at that city level in shaping up circular futures. And Read London have recently published a study and looking at what are the employment opportunities. And they estimate potentially 500,000 people could be employed by 2030. So that's massive. When I work with companies here in South Africa, there's this big hesitation in thinking about how do we create a circular business model, because we do need to decouple ourselves from what we understand to be a model of revenue generation, and how do we think about these things differently. And quite often, I think we get stuck in a scarcity mindset and in thinking about the abundance opportunities differently, similarly to what like London have done, and thinking about how many jobs can this actually enable is something that's worth exploring. And that's only possible when we start to take a more systems perspective and thinking about who are the individuals in our space, what is accessible to our local economies, what kind of materials are we using, what kind of materials could we be reusing, and shaping up more strategic aspects of what might be possible. I think every single city around the world is very different. Some are facing elements of population growth. I mean, definitely across the continent here in Africa, we've got that as a future reality that we need to be working with and thinking about and planning towards. There are other parts in Central Europe that are, the word depopulating comes up, but there's this aspect like the youth and the population are a little bit smaller, and the growth of that is a little bit smaller than what we're experiencing down here on the continent. So how do we shape up a future that isn't driven by an aggressive growth model on this linear take, where make and dispose, and how do we really start to think about shifting that into a circular perspective? There's two initiatives that I've been working with here, and the one is around, we've been doing a baseline study together with ICI Africa and GIZ, and looking at the reuse economy potentials in 3 different cities in South Africa. And through that perspective, and it really just drums home what Sophie's been speaking about, you need to understand what are those enabling conditions and start to reflect on what are the policy levers at play, and maybe what are some of those potential gaps that exist. I think it's easy for us to say, oh, we can do all of these different things, but if we don't see what is in the system, what those gaps might be, it becomes really difficult to then hold those collective conversations with different stakeholders and thinking about how do we shape this up, where even if policy isn't enabling it, maybe we could do something a little bit beneath the system to create those. And so there's a lot that is at play in these spaces. And in thinking about some of the work we've also done in Kenya and analyzing the repair and reuse economy, there's a large proportion of the economy that is more commonly known as informal. So how do we ensure that these strategies that we start to put into place that can enable circular cities create a more inclusive design of citizens that aren't necessarily participating in the formal part of the economy, but are participating on the fringes, and quite often go unrecognized and operate in a very invisible way. So that's kind of the message that I'd like to impart with you today, in thinking about circular futures, and thinking about our circular cities, even in thinking about urban design models. How do we ensure that they're inclusive, that they're equitable, that they have the opportunity to create or allow for people to create livelihood strategies for themselves that can exist both in the formal and the informal part of these city economies. So I'll pause there. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to hearing from the others. There's definitely a lot of smart people here. Wonderful. Kitty, Anika, back over to you.
Thank you, Kelly. That was very interesting. As you have the experience on like the European market, but also the African markets, and also the 3 example cities you were talking about with the reuse potentials, what would you say is like the one thing that the European market can potentially take as a learning from these 3 projects you were mentioning in South Africa?
Great question. I think what we do in the work, whenever we go into these ecosystems to understand what might be possible, definitely we need to take a collective approach in thinking about what is this future that we are going to co-create together and understand and put forward as an opportunity to work towards. I think the years gone by, I've seen, and having been involved in other industrial development opportunities in South Africa, sometimes we kind of the process isn't completely inclusive. We think of private-public models, but what about private, public, and citizenry models in thinking about creating collective change? I think we also need to make sure that the decisions being made aren't necessarily informing either a purely public or purely private agenda, and that the agenda does include the social citizens that we've got. And maybe for the market up north, let's also think about the dynamic. Our global systems are shifting, where people are living are shifting. Their communities, like island communities especially, are being displaced because of climate change. We're going to have more people moving into areas where they're less exposed to the biggest impacts of climate, so less flooding, maybe areas that are a little bit more water resilient, or moving into cities where they've got infrastructure that has the ability to service people just to meet basic needs. And so I think I'd like to encourage all of us in thinking about circular cities in the north. How can we also ensure that there's an inclusive design element that allows for societies, not just from within, but from across the globe, to have an opportunity to learn from each other, experience change, and also have that chance to kind of reshape how we envision citizens coexisting in our cities going forward?
Thank you, Kelly. I think we will definitely cover these topics in the discussion later on again. I mean, the ecosystem topic will definitely come up again, and also the inclusive design. I think that's very interesting to hear from you. I think we would then continue with Stephanie with a short presentation. Stephanie worked as a facade engineer and was the global sustainability lead of Axley O'Gallagher. And most recently, in 2023, she joined the engineering and project management consultancy CETEC in Paris, which is focusing on circular economy. Over to you, Stephanie.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks again for the invitation. So indeed, I am a circularity engineer at CETEC, which is a pluridisciplinary engineering firm in France, and I work in the building department. So today I will try to discuss mainly the buildings and the construction in France and how the cities organize around this approach. So before talking about cities, we need to speak about what's happening at the country scale, because as you may know, French is very much of a top-down model, and actually a lot has been happening recently at the national level with regards to circularity. And indeed, starting from 2015, there was a first law which was aiming at getting 70% of material recovered for the construction waste by 2020. And it's something that most of all was actually a gift, but it was targeting a recovery which can be very vast. And a big change has been done in 2022 because 2 years ago, we got a new environmental standard. So it's in addition to energy requirements, we had this new requirements to do life cycle analysis for all the new building. So it's mandatory for the new building, and then it's an approach that is done for the refurbishment projects. So we have a regulation to do this calculation, but we have also limits to respect. And the limits, they are more and more stringent with the years. And so we have to all the time improve to get to the targets of the country. And so it starts to be difficult to get to this limit. And as an incentive, when we use a reclaimed material, we consider that they account for zero. So the more you use reused products, the less the embodied carbon from the regulation is. So it's really an incentive that we see every day in our projects. And then regarding the waste, also since last year, there has been a massive change in the industry with a new anti-waste law. It has different chapters, but the main two ones are that first, it's mandatory now to do material inventory in our deconstruction and in the significant refurbishment with surfaces higher than 1,000 square meters. So it's mandatory to do it, but also to track all the material and flow, and at the end of the construction to justify what happened to this material. And so it's really to promote reuse and refurbishment and recycling. And then there has been a creation of a REP, so it's an extended responsibility for the producer. It's a new scheme for building material, which I will try to explain because it has changed a lot the way we deal with waste in territories. So try to bear with me, but when a construction company buy products, now they have to pay an additional tax, which is called an eco-tax. So they give it to the producer, and on the site, the producer gives this amount to an eco-organization. These are new actors in the construction, and actually their main goal is to finance the deployment of waste operator across all the territory. So it needs to be really local. And these operators, their goal is to collect the material for free for all the sites, the construction sites. And the construction sites, it's mandatory also to sort all the waste according to 7 typologies of waste. So it's actually a virtuous circle that is financed by himself. And the goal is really to massify good recycling of material, not mixed recycling material, and to finance also all the reclaim material system. And today, I think we are on the average of the European rate. We have a reuse very low. It's less than 1% of material. But with all this new incentive and regulation, step by step, we aim at getting 5% of reuse on the sites by 2028. So it's really ambitious. So now, how do territories and cities respond to these challenges? Actually, it's good because the territories have been able to prepare a lot in advance, and they have created initiative. And one of the most exemplary maybe is Pleine Commune, which is an organization of 9 cities in the north of Paris. And they have really tried to think deep into it, what is urban metabolism, how territory absorb flows, stock it, use them, digest them, and what they can produce. So it has been really big thinking study, and they have developed one of the first charter around circular economy signed by the collectivities, a commitment, and they have done a pilot test for projects. As you can see on the right, they have done very innovative pilot tests to reuse concrete and bricks that are the main construction materials in the territory. Another example is Toulouse in the south of France. They have won a European call, and they were able to follow for 5 years 58 exemplary sites to develop circular economy. And it has been extremely beneficial for all France, actually, because they have developed guidelines, very interesting administrative and technical guidance after this that we use every day. And they have really developed the actors in this area. Another example similar is the MGP, it's the Greater Paris Metropolis, again, an association of different collectivities around Paris. In the same way, they have developed a charter signed by all, and they have done many studies to understand the flows of material, how they can be absorbed, what were the existing actors, which one were to develop, and in the same way for the platforms. And we are actually working with them, with CETEC, to try to identify again pilot projects in 12 collectivities, and to try to push for maximum circularity in general, and then to share the experiment and create a ready-to-use kit. So it's really happening a lot in France, and in front of this regulation from the nation and organization in the territories, we will see how construction players respond to these challenges. So it's really interesting because since now we have to do inventory and to follow material, we have had the diagnosticians that appear to do them, and now we have consultants in circularity that are developing a lot. Same thing, careful disposal workers, the reconditioner logistician. So it has really created a new ecosystem to make a match between the demand and the offer. And the platforms are developing, and they can be really specialized or more general. So many of them are being created on all the territory. And well, just as a conclusion, I just found this study last week, and I found it would be really interesting for our talk. there was this study which has been made, which is called the Power of 10, and it was trying to study what was the right scale for climate action, and it was starting from individuals to world action. And really interestingly, they found out that the most powerful scale to act is between 10,000 and 100,000 people. So really the scales of the cities and communities. And so 80% of actions we can do for climate change, they can be done at this scale. And it can be really powerful because it's also the right scale to have social tipping points. It means that when you do an action that is positive, it can be really contagious and then done by other cities. And then it really leads to climate action, which is powerful. So in circularity, it's really what we see, what's happening in the city has a tremendous importance. And actually the urban metabolism that we've seen in the first part with Pleine Commune, there was before just one territory before 2010 that was dealing with this kind of study of the territory. And now, 10 years after, it has been really contagious and all the territory are dealing with this kind of study of territory. And it's also what we've seen with all this initiative, but now it's not very much like before centralized in Paris. It's really the resurgence of territories with the development of circular economy actors across all the territory. So it shows that all this organization at this scale can be very powerful and really accelerate the push for people to act in their project. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. I think those were great examples from France, seeing how the policy works, but at the same time how local projects and companies can bring the whole topic of circular economy forward. Maybe one question to you, like you showed the slide with the local ecosystems and the new expertises that are developing. Do you feel like these ecosystems are more on a local level, or they're also spreading all over France, or maybe also internationally in a way?
Well, it's both from national and local, from what I can say, and then for sure internationally. But we really see actors coming from all the regions, and each one has their speciality. And it's really interesting because when you work on a project, they have different material from one region to another. So it's great to see that they can really specialize according to the specificities of the territories. And also when we respond, for example, to offer to develop studies at the scale of the territories, they really insist that we should always consider local employment. So really circularity goes hand in hand with local. And it's what is really interesting because, as I was saying before, it was really centralized in big cities, and now each region starts to do things, and they have all their ecosystems and many meetings and meetups with regards to this and everywhere.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think we already hear that, like in the different regions, the same effects are kind of developing. We heard it from South Africa, from Kelly, and now also in France. I think that's great to hear. I would then give over to Cornelia, giving a short presentation. She is the international liaison for the Amsterdam Smart City. She's also the founder of Sustainable Amsterdam, a consultancy focused on transferring Amsterdam-based approaches for sustainable development internationally. Over to you, Cornelia.
Thank you, Annika, and thank you for the opportunity to also contribute a little bit the experience and the approach from Amsterdam on this, let's say, journey to become a circular city. So it's, I would say, quite an impossible task to try and paint a picture of that in 5 minutes, but I will do my best to give you a bit of an overview of kind of how this topic came up in 2014, 2015. That's also kind of when I started to get involved in this innovation ecosystem in Amsterdam, let's say. And let's say the evolution and where we are now. So I'm just going to try and share my screen. So hopefully now you see some slides. So in 2015, I was saying there was the circular city scan that was kind of the basics or the foundation for trying to get a grip on what are these material flows in the city. So really kind of thinking about what are the materials coming in, what do we consume and what do we expel as waste, let's say. So it was really focused on materials, but also on energy. And by now, this circular city scan approach, I think, is also something that's become quite typical as a starting point for any city or country or region. So different scales, trying to kind of get a grip on where do you want to put your energy. And an example of an important insight that came out of this circular city scan was this idea that about 50% of materials coming in and out of the city have to do actually with the construction and demolition sector. And that is probably because Amsterdam is also a city that is growing, that's quite attractive, and where we have quite a bit of construction. But you can probably expect something very similar from other similar cities, and maybe something quite different from cities that are shrinking potentially. Yeah, but this circular city scan was, let's say, a first starting point to be able to get a grip on what are these different value chains that we should focus our energy on. So I mentioned already the construction sector or the built environment was one that came out as being quite important, and it's also one that you see carried through all the policies coming since then. So this first, let's say, really a program with kind of this thinking of how do we stimulate different initiatives, not just by the government, but really also with startups, with civil society, with all kinds of different stakeholders, with knowledge institutions, also very importantly. That came in 2018. So it was a 2-year program, the Circular Innovation Program. And it's always really, I think, important to look at where does this program originate? So in Amsterdam's case, it originated in what was at the time called the Chief Technology Office, currently called the Innovation Team. At the time, it was a very small team of only 8 people. The rest of the organization, you can say, was not necessarily very interested in this concept. Certainly not the economics department. So it was really something that came from this kind of innovation department where they just wanted to experiment and try new ways of doing things, and really very much also focusing on how do you involve different parties in pilots, and also starting to think about what are these laws and regulations that are obstructing the circular, the transition to a circular economy. That was already at that time, I think, a very important appreciation was the fact that in many cases it's about really looking at these policy levers that were already mentioned, I think, by some of the other speakers. And that program ended up being quite successful, and it got quite some attention, and it won some awards. And then slowly but surely, other departments within the municipality started to really pick up on and develop other strategies and kind of embed this idea of circularity into the rest of the organization. Currently, there is a circular strategy 2020 to 2025, which which focuses on 3 main value chains. So the built environment is still an important one. The food and organic waste streams as a second pillar, also something that came out of the original city scan back in 2015 as one of the value chains with a lot of opportunities. And then the last one, the consumer goods, also because increasingly in the last few years, we're realizing, especially in a city like Amsterdam, ultimately, personal behavior and all the things that we consume, this is also something very important that we need to tackle, and also something that is showing up more and more in the different analyses and the evolution of these tools. So we've had a lot of discussions in the last few years, also, again, connecting it to the discussion of consumer goods, for example. So when we talk about circularity, where do you define these boundaries? Can be very tricky. And this kind of scope 3 emissions also is another way that you can think about it quite often. This dilemma, so if we are actually producing consuming all kinds of goods that are actually produced halfway across the world, how do you deal with that responsibility? So are those also emissions that we have to take responsibility for? So not just from an emissions perspective, but also from the perspective of the, let's say, the working conditions or other environmental impacts or negative externalities generated through this consumption. So a lot of these topics were kind of bubbling up, and the donut model, I think many of you are probably familiar with it. has kind of been a very useful tool to try and bring all of that complexity in one place. But that's also very difficult to do, because it's nice to have a model, but then how do you operationalize it? That's, of course, always the big challenge. And when we talk about operationalization, then also very important to mention is this circular economy monitor, which the city launched in February 2022. And so you see there's quite a lag. We start with this nice kind of circular city scan. We have nice experiments. And only actually in 2022, so quite a few years later, we're actually having a monitor where we can actually track progress. And that was not an easy thing to develop for the city, because most cities don't have a way of monitoring how they're doing on circularity. And this is still very much work in progress in an area where the city is looking for a collaboration with other cities on how to actually really monitor and how to use data in a very effective way to steer towards more circular, towards this goal of ultimately become a circular city by 2050, which, again, ultimately, we still don't know exactly how to get there, but to make it a bit more concrete, I wanted to maybe, and just very quickly, again, this is a recap of these 3 value chains without going into detail on them. And then this idea of the donut portrait, like I mentioned, where you see the green, this is really this, this social foundation. So in a Western city like Amsterdam, where for the most part, quite affluent, quite wealthy. So we're quite good, let's say, for the most part, taking care of these social basics. But you see very quickly in red that we're overshooting a lot of planetary boundaries. And without a doubt, if you're going to carry out this exercise, and I think it's happening in more cities, so probably if we look at Paris, or we look at London, or we look at Copenhagen, you probably get a very similar portrait. But then if we look at Cape Town, or if we look at Nairobi, or if we look at Manila, then we actually get quite a different picture. But it's a nice tool where we can be using the same language, and again, kind of bringing together the kind of social, environmental, local, and global perspectives. How to operationalize this? Again, we would need a much more time to get into that. But I wanted to maybe just to make it more concrete, to share 2 concrete examples of how this topic really started in this small scale experimental way. And the Kovel is still one of the best places to really go and experience what this start of the circular economy meant for Amsterdam. And this is a former shipyard in Amsterdam North, where historically we had a lot of shipbuilding. And this is an area that's very quickly transforming now to new districts. But at the time, so about 11, 12 years ago, the city was wondering, how can we stimulate some development at a time of crises when there was no interest from developers to build anything? So what the city decided to do is to host a competition for temporary use. And they asked basically to create what we call a breeding place. So these are kind of hubs where creative people can work at a low cost. And that's part of the city's policy to keep creative people in the city. And what was very special is the city asked for a high ambition for sustainability. They were not prescriptive. They didn't say what that meant. They wanted to be inspired. And the result is this kind of circularity playground, which is really a spot that has inspired a lot of other ideas around circularity. So it's a with quite limited resources. Basically, what you're looking at is this location where these houseboats which are normally discarded in Amsterdam because there's no secondhand market for houseboats. So they kind of refurbish those into these places where creatives or small businesses can work in. So these kinds of studios that are self-sufficient in terms of producing their own electricity and managing their own wastewater and sewage with these kind of low-cost decentralized systems. So that's a very quick explanation of quite a complex project, which then, like I said, inspired a lot of other initiatives, to the point that a few years later, one of the nicest kind of showcases for the circularity is Schoonskip. And it's actually many of the same people who were involved in the Kovel. These projects are actually also very close to each other. So the Kovel, these kind of idealistic people with a low budget and kind of this DIY way managed to get the support and inspire decision makers to say, hey, we can build in a different way. And eventually this kind of community-led bottom-up initiative to build a sustainable floating neighborhood. So it aims to be the most sustainable floating neighborhood in Amsterdam and possibly in Europe and beyond. with all kinds of innovations from, that it has its own energy system, a kind of community-owned energy system, to the way water is recycled. And on every level, really, they've kind of gone above and beyond in terms of really creating a very sustainable community. The big challenge at the moment is really how do we scale these solutions, because it's still only 100 residents. And if we talk about these challenges on a global scale, well, that's certainly not, it's something that we need to be able to scale and make affordable, make sure that it's not actually only for the lucky few. That's also a discussion that comes up a lot. So just to kind of wrap it up, maybe with a few lessons learned and recommendations. And there's a very nice report kind of reflecting on these lessons learned and recommendations from a few years ago. So I won't go into them in details, but I think this question of how do we go from experimentation to systemic change, also to link it into today's topic, it's something that we've really struggled in Amsterdam. But I think learning by doing slowly, we do see this bridge from a bunch of experiments to how do you actually translate that into policy, and how do you translate that into large-scale application. Something else that we've realized is very important is to kind of look at circularity and connect it. I already mentioned these kinds of social issues, and kind of look beyond CO2 emissions and even just materials to all kinds of other social indicators that might be relevant. And I really like the reflection from South Africa. Informal economies, maybe not so relevant in Amsterdam, but certainly very much so in other parts of the world. And then maybe also the last point, very much also linked to this question of systemic change. If you really look at what are these different levers that you can act on. So procurement is really a very good example as a local municipality, but as a governmental authority in general. And this is also an example where the city of Amsterdam, for example, now has a circular land tendering approach. And that's also very particular in Amsterdam because the city owns a lot of land, so it has a lot of control, so it can put very high demands for developing land or new developments to a circular standard. But this is an example of how to move from this pilot and experiments to more systemic change, and procurement certainly plays a big role. So I will maybe just leave it at that, and happy to take some questions. And very sorry again for the connectivity challenge earlier.
Thank you very much, Cornelia. I think there was lots of content and very interesting to hear from the Netherlands, which are probably one of the leading countries in that whole field. So great to hear the work from Amsterdam. But another country or city that is great, doing great works and great projects is Copenhagen. And we have Anders, who is a director from Linnea Architects, working in Copenhagen, or I think right now he's in Berlin, but the office is mainly based in Copenhagen. And Linnea has realized a dozen of buildings based on radical material and business model innovation, which is why we want to give over to you, Anders.
Thank you so very much. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you also to the speakers before me. I think you created more than a solid base and sufficient data to build on. I could see from the planning that I was last in the row of speakers, so I have the great opportunity of being able to actually maybe take a little bit more of a bottom-up approach and show how we actually work with these many perspectives that are presented here today. I'm just going to share my screen. So yeah, just to recap, my name is Anders Kurtzner, and I'm director at Linnea. We are a hybrid architectural innovation studio based in Copenhagen, in Iceland, and in Germany, in Berlin as well. I have a bit of a different background. I have a background in cultural studies, so anthropology and sociology, and then work within innovation management for most of my career. So I'm not necessarily particularly interested in the product. I'm interested in the process and many of the guiding aspects and decision-making processes that leads us to the final product. So just a quick recap for those of you who don't know us. We have worked mainly within the enabling space. So the visionary approach that we have developed over the past 15 years has been grounded in a very aggressive approach towards actually realizing the projects we have envisioned based on bioregionality, resource regionality, circular economy, and many of these emerging dynamics we see in the market and in across many different industries. I want to talk about today cities as a resource bank for the future, because I believe that there is maybe not within this group, but there's a flawed understanding of circular economy that is something that needs to happen today and forward. We very much believe in our practice that we need to base our understanding of what is already around us, since many of the resources we believe that will be available to us in the future are already here and are not to be extracted from the natural environment. So a bit more radical approach, but let's see how it goes. One of the first buildings we managed to realize was this. It's called Resource Rose. And this is based on this resource regionality approach, where everything in this building is actually upcycled materials, upcycled what I guess we would call still to this day waste materials from either buildings being torn down. The concrete that is used in this building are miscastings from the metro construction site in Copenhagen at the time. The windows are upcycled from a social housing project that underwent energy renovations at the time, and so on and so forth. So many of these products are actually sourced locally and brought into the building site, reprocessed, and then created into this building. The second one, which is, I guess, visually one of the most recognizable ones, is Resource Rose, where, of course, based on the proud Danish tradition of brick buildings, we realized that in the 1950s and 1960s, we started adding cement to the mortar between the bricks, which actually means that the bricks are now bound together. This perfect circular material is actually bound together forever. And whenever we are tearing down these red and yellow brick buildings, they are now becoming road fill. And just as we heard from Paris, we have the same kind of downward going CO2 requirements for our buildings, which actually means that the CO2 heaviness of the brick is actually it makes it almost impossible within a couple of years to actually build with these bricks because they're too CO2 heavy. So we're actually talking about preserving national heritage. And what we did here was that we actually got 5 buildings that were going to be demolished, an old brewery from the Carlsberg site here in Copenhagen, and a couple of schools from across the country. And we cut them up into 1 by 1 meter slabs, and we created a whole new facade system out of it as well, which is of course fully dismantleable and can go into to be recirculated in future projects. This is one of our latest projects. It's one of the more ambitious projects where we've taken everything we learned over the past 12, 13 years. It's called the Swan, and it's a kindergarten built just north of Copenhagen. And what you see on the picture here is the finished result, but all the materials were sourced from an existing school building that was standing on site, that due to a number of technical and material related difficulties, we could not reuse the building as a transformation project. So we did a whole process for dismantling the existing building, did a circular building site where we actually cleaned all the materials on site and moved them back into the construction project to actually realize the building you see here today. So all the materials here are actually sourced from the existing building that was on site, which of course speaks to the enormous complexity we see, not just in terms of material use, but also, as it's always also been mentioned, regulatory policy, tender processes, procurement, all of these many layers needed to be managed. It was much more than just an architectural project. So we're very proud of this, and would like to talk some more about this and the enabling, how we actually got to this. I'm going to skip the last one because I think it's time for a short provocation, because one of the questions is, how do we actually scale this, and how do we actually ensure that we get kick-started for real the circular economy within the built environment. And I want to start the last part of my presentation by saying build nothing. That is the easiest and most effective way for us, at least in our practice, to get to the level of innovation that is required from a material level, from a building, from a city level, but also from a policy level. If we actually give ourselves the creative, put ourselves in a creative deadlock and say, what if we can't build anything? What if nothing is available to us anymore? What do we do? We heard about growing population in different parts of the world. We need to look at alternative resource streams and so on. So in order to kind of maybe alleviate a little bit of the tension by building nothing, and for those of you who are sitting out there who are maybe thinking about quitting their job tomorrow, I think we need to understand what we mean by build nothing. And I've broken that down into 4 areas where I think from a bottom-up perspective, we have been able to take an idea to realize a building, to then influence policy and garner more support for our future projects from a national, but also from a European approach. The first thing is we need to change the fundamental understanding to the fact that everything has value. As many of you know, waste is also a legal definition, and I can tell from experience that the term waste sticks to materials and our understanding of materials more than you would believe. So the brick, when it's in the wall, it is a structural element, and when it's taken out of the second it's been taken out of the wall, it's a piece of waste. So we need to understand, and we also need to develop a very keen and very a very maybe naive approach to understanding how to understand these value systems. And as I said, we have done this in multiple projects. The activity you see here to the left is actually from the first project I showed you. It's cutting out of these old walls, and what you see to the right is the innovative project that we have done, where we've actually sunk these facade systems into wood and hemp-free backing to build a new wall system. What we're also doing is that we're looking at scarcity in terms of resources. In Denmark alone, we throw out 400,000 tons of wood every year. We incinerate it, waste it. And what we have done here, together with a brilliant PhD student at our practice, come up with a complete structural, not just a nice looking thing, but a structural beam made out of everything from EU pallets to waste wood and so on, things that are just going to be thrown away or incinerated for energy production. But these are actually structural beams that are able to hold many, many, many tons. So this is also one of the approaches where we say, okay, this is just a waste material. What can we pick out, and what can actually become refined to a level that it becomes a solid and a valid and a valuable building material. And this is actually a product we have recently commercialized together with a partner. This is a partition wall system that is based out of offcuts from the wood industry, and the glass is actually discarded windows from the window production industry, where you would actually burn the wood and you would crush up the windows when there would be misproductions or failed productions and so on. So we have actually merged these two industries and done the entire value chain and business model setup. And today you can buy this at scale, and it saves 80% of the CO2 from a traditional partition wall system. So it's just to say, if we refine and if we understand how to recategorize these materials, then there's tremendous value, and there is value in everything. We just need to find it. The second part is that what gets mapped gets managed. It's of course a play on the what gets measured gets managed. But what we mean by that is that we need to understand the resources that are actually available to us. As mentioned, I'm currently in Berlin, and there are many things going on in terms of the digital space. So we have the Madasta, who's really making a a great impact in this space and mapping everything from buildings to entire cities and huge portfolios of buildings. But we really need to understand what is in our buildings in order to create both policies, but maybe most important guidelines for understanding our buildings, for actually understanding what our buildings and resources can become. We need to map them. So we have always done that by looking at the existing buildings, but also going into the buildings, opening the buildings up and understanding how they are constructed, the different layers, the different materials that are in them, and then compile them in a catalog. Because what happens when you start compiling and refining these materials as you find them, they become valuable. You can talk about them. You can give this catalog to a partner to give prices on what is the cost to reprocess these materials for future use and so on and so forth. So all of a sudden, this resource catalog becomes a tender tool. It becomes a design tool for the architects and designers to work with to say, okay, how can we actually put these materials back into our building or use them to the highest value possible? And that's where we are also able to say, how much value do we actually have in this building that we are looking at, or this area, or this part of the city we have? So how many CO2 equivalents are actually embodied or embedded in the materials today? How much of the material is actually available to us in great condition? And how much money in relative value, replacement value, does it actually represent? If we're going to buy 500 new windows, if we can reuse a certain percentage of the ones that are already there, what is that financial impact on the actual economy of circulating this into a building project? And then when we have an overview of these enormous quantities of materials that, believe me, that are available to us, we just need to understand their value and how to get to them, then we can start designing with them. And that's the third party where we say form follows availability. The way we develop today is that we sit in a room, we have an idea for a building, maybe we have some requirements, and then we just do it and we hope that it works. We want to take a different approach, saying like we need to understand the materials we have to work with, and then let those materials and their availability inform the design process. So how do we actually do that? We actually take the mappings, the resource mappings that we have, and then we develop scenarios. How can we cut this building up? How can we transform this? How can we take some of these materials out, make them into something else that has a higher value, and introduce them back into the building as well? And this is not just fun and games and some easy, sales pitch for an architect. This is also a guiding tool for the decision making, because that means that when we come up with our initial design processes or initial design phases, we can actually take many different paths and show different scenarios and how those different design decisions impact in terms of CO2, how much existing materials we have, how many more materials we need to have, and start up a whole documentation process where the environmental impact of the decision we're taking are actually upfront and actually guiding the process we're doing. I'll just see if this works. So this is an illustration of how we are doing a project in the center of Berlin. It's on pause right now. This is a parking house in the center of Berlin, which we are transforming by taking the materials that are available out of the building. We are recutting every single level of the parking house. We're taking the existing concrete structure, recutting that together with windows from the neighboring building that is being energy renovated, moving that back into the existing building, filling it up with the amount of wood and biogenic isolation materials we need. And we take all these materials back into the building and develop it from there. So the design of this building has been based on the idea that we don't do anything. We just take what is already there and we design the building based on that. And the last part is what we call in partners and risk we trust. I think it has been mentioned by all of you at this point that what we need in order to actually realize this are new value chains, it's new partnerships, it's new competencies, and it's new engagement models of how we actually work together. So in many of our projects, we actually front load a lot of the specialists that would actually be introduced in a traditional project. We actually front load them and actually have a much more integrated sparring in terms of what is possible, what can be done, challenge assumptions, and demystify. Because there are risks associated with doing something new and doing something in a different way. So we want to be transparent, and we also want to address those risks with the best and the most professional competencies we have available. And the last thing I want to say is that we use our products and we use our buildings and we use our processes as educational materials as well. So all the partners we have in our processes often end up changing their business model because they have learned to do something new. They're not just demolishers anymore. They now know how to dismantle a building, how to preserve the value of the materials, reprocess the materials, and actually make them available for buildings again. We do all the testing, we do all the compliance, and we are fully within the scope of the existing regulatory system, while at the same time pushing the building legislation in every project we are, because we could prove time and time again that the things that we are saying that are not possible, that they are actually possible when it comes to the point. So actually focusing on developing the competences as part of the process is a huge key for us, and some of the key enablers for actually scaling the circular economy on a city level. I think that's it for me.
Amazing. Thank you so much, everyone. It was super interesting to hear from such different industry perspectives. So we just have one question before we move on to audience questions. So if everyone can drop their questions in the chat, and then we'll just ask this and go on. So yeah, if we start quite general, this panel is quite exciting because we're working with people working in circularity, each sitting in a different city. So it'd be great if we could go around and understand one or two opportunities and barriers in each of these cities. And we've heard policy mentioned quite a few times today. So maybe we could address that, and how much is local government and policy shaping the landscape of circularity? And if we start with Sophie. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. First of all, so amazing to listen to all of the other speakers presenting today. It was super, super interesting. And I got very excited when there was the no more buildings suggested as well. That's super, super fun to think along those lines. But with reference to your question about opportunities and barriers and how policy can play into that, I think when I was initially speaking, I said that there are very clear opportunities for the built environment in terms of reducing the need for new construction. So that's no more buildings, and increasing the resource efficiency and reducing construction and operational costs. But at the same time, huge barriers that cities, people working for local city councils and governments have found is that they don't have the capacity or resources to tackle these problems and implement circularity solutions that they'd like to. So I think that's number one as a key barrier. I think number two is securing political support across the board. And this is partly due to most experts and industries working in silos. And so there's really this need for more collaboration and more working together on these solutions, because that's the only way it's going to really secure this political buy-in. A third barrier, I think, would be measurement. This is both in terms of data collection. Mapping material flows across most cities is a complete nightmare. They have no idea what's coming in, what's coming out, where it's been across the world before. So I think there's that. And then there's also, then if you have started mapping that and you start to gain insight of what's coming in and out, you then, as a city, need to develop monitoring frameworks as well. So there's this technological and like data analysis aspect that needs to be implemented on top of it. And finally, I think I mentioned it briefly before, there's this paradigm that you need to shift from the linear way of thinking to a more circular one. So that's really in terms of, I guess, a little bit of educating the people working in cities to start thinking about that. But then also when they come up with these more circular ideas, thinking about the wider supply chains and how that operates in. Because, yeah, for example, just reusing the materials from the building is not going to get you very far. You need to engage the wider system in that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think definitely mapping like supply chains, which can stretch over several continents, is such an issue when we're thinking about systems thinking. And then if we could pass over to Kelly, please.
Thanks, team. It's quite a loaded question. I'm just trying to think like who's the audience in this response. But I think just what does sit within me is just to, no matter where you are along this like ecosystem of being able to contribute and create change. I definitely want to encourage people to try and approach this with as open a mind as possible and go in there with the biggest level of curiosity, what might be possible. So yeah, let's build with no I forget the saying now, but no buildings. So let's not build. Let's go and approach this with that mindset. Let's also think about how do we test our assumptions as early as possible. So adopt innovation methodologies up front and really bring in other people from across that ecosystem to help us better understand, like, are we on the right trajectory in our thinking? Are we assuming the correct things that might be possible and might be true? And then what do we need to do to understand that as we go along? So that's what I'd like to encourage everybody here today, is really thinking about creating those enabling systems and getting people to start collaboratively thinking about what might be possible earlier on and upfront, and testing your assumptions often and as early as possible as you can throughout this process. And at some point, you will eventually get to a moment when it starts to make a lot more sense and what is possible to create circular futures that are inclusive in design. I think inclusivity needs to be baked into how we think about creating circular cities in the future. So I'll pass it back to you, Kitty.
Thanks. And in the interest of time, we'll pass over to Stephanie quickly.
Yes, so regarding the regulation, we've seen it in the presentation, but also what's happening in the city, how they push also for not building and reusing material is regarding the urban planning. And actually, for example, in Paris, they are redefining the urban planning, and one of the first initiatives was to identify lands where they could put platforms and new actors. So they really plan in advance for this to make it possible, and then to include these people within the territory. And in the same way, they have new criteria to giving planning permission, and so the buildings have to demonstrate that for the easy material, they are able to integrate reclaimed material, and now it's really clear what exists and how much you can push for reuse. And now we have also feeling for numbers because as it was said before, the numbers, it's really powerful to justify the circular strategies. And so, yes, the urban planning has a lot to do in this, and by letting people have space. And also, I forgot to mention that now we have a new law as well, which is called ZAN. It's Net Zero Artificialization of Land. And so it goes step by step, and it's soon impossible to build in a non-artificial area. And so it really makes you think much more about refurbishment and conversion of building, reversibility, and this one, and transition cities as we've seen before. So it's really interesting as well to have the studies of land.
Thanks, Stephanie. And then over to Cornelia, please.
Sure. So just to kind of throw in a couple of thoughts that I don't think have been mentioned yet. When we talk about the circular economy, I think ultimately one of the most important kind of foundational principles is really this idea of true pricing and pricing externalities, which of course people have different ways of kind of getting to the same point, but I think that's really very fundamental. And it's very easy for, cities to say, okay, but that's not within our jurisdiction, we need a national government, or we need EU, or you're never going to get a carbon tax or a material tax on a global level, and it's of course very daunting, but there are things that different levels of government can do in all of these respects. And related to that, I think whenever we talk about circularity, also very, very practical, again, not easy, but very important, is this discussion of shifting the burden or the tax away from labor to materials. So probably many of you have had this experience, at least again, if we especially in developed or Western contexts, if I go down the street and try to fix my shoes, I'm told, oh, but you can just buy a new pair, and it'll be cheaper than fixing those. And that has a lot to do with the fact that labor is expensive and these materials are not. So reshifting that, again, that's something that most cities can do on their own, but they can definitely come together and lobby on a national level, in many cases European level, in order to change some of these incentives. And then maybe one other note, because everyone's jumping on this provocation, which has worked very well. So the build nothing provocation. I like that. But I think, again, it's important to bring in this kind of global north versus global south perspective, because I think we have to be very honest about, again, the kind of disproportional footprint and impact that we have in the Western world, and these cities, like we just mentioned, in the global South, they still have a long ways to go in terms of developing and building things. What I think we want to prevent is that they build, for example, a lot of parking garages, again, to stay on point with the example that you gave. And then 10 years later, we realize that this is outdated infrastructure and we need to demolish or rebuild it. So indeed, kind of making sure that what we build is actually resilient and regenerative, and we're doing the right thing. And of course, land use is very important in that. I would say maybe demolish nothing with an asterisk, and then a lot of caveats around this kind of global north, global south discussion. But I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah, Anders, if we just touch on you, you agreeing a lot with that?
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think it's a very valid point. I think the bias that was woven into that provocation also comes from the realization of the richness of this part of the world, and just how plentiful and wasteful it is. And to jump on your point as well, I think one of the things that we see on a very practical level in the greater Copenhagen area and in Denmark is in general is to actually look at new developments as integrated into demolition. Like, that's what we are doing. Cities are limited in area. Whenever we have a new idea for a new building or a new area, we have to demolish a lot of stuff. So what is happening now and what is being tested on a policy level here is actually very granular pre-demolition screenings, where resource mappings, where basically trying to understand the buildings that are going to be torn down, and basically almost creating an application where it's like, can we please tear these buildings down? We have exhausted every single opportunity in terms of transforming them, reusing the materials, and so on and so forth, and creating a full spectrum of catalog for other citywide distribution factors, and actually requiring the potential demolisher to actually take an active part in becoming a part of the circular economy. So I think from a policy level, having this regulatory toolbox to say that we need to exhaust all possible opportunities for keeping as much of our building stock and using that to as high value as possible, but also providing all these great tools that everyone here has been talking about that are available, also providing them to the actual community so they can document these buildings and help them exhaust the vast amount of opportunities that are within the building environment already.
Thanks everyone for that. So just if we quickly move on to some audience questions. Cornelia, what you were saying about the global north versus global south leads me on to Alex wrote a question in the chat, which I think I will direct to Kelly. So he's put in the chat, to what extent does the implementation of circular cities in the global south largely by global North companies / consultants could be described as some form of modern colonialism. So yeah, that's quite a difficult one, but let you quickly take that.
No, it's the reality. So I don't think that that's something we shy away from. The truth is that these are concerns in the real world. And when I mean reality, that it's a conversation that's taking place. It's not to say that everyone's on a modern version of colonialism. No, not at all. But there are these considerations that we do come from different contexts. Are we making sure that we are being inclusive in how we're approaching opportunities, that where we are being able to do work in countries that we don't live in? I feel the same when I'm being asked to do stuff in, say, London. And well, I don't know London enough. I definitely can come in, but what we do, and I think we need to be thinking about, is just embracing diversity of perspectives and coming into these conversations. I think we also need to understand that there are far bigger complexities at play geopolitically. If you look at how trade agreements are being set up. And so some of that is out of our control, but we do have a role to play in making sure that we are having the right conversations, making sure that we're not coming into a context that we're not familiar with, acting as if we know, because we don't necessarily know. Rather, see yourself as a facilitator of conversations where you have the ability to bring in some shared experiences, but use that as a chance to also learn, to hear what else about this. Because, you know, I'm just thinking about the future of cities here on the continent. It's very different to the future of cities in Europe. The infrastructure is just very different. We've developed in completely different ways. I crave people here in South Africa to actually have more space because it gives you a chance to do more in your garden and things like that. Space is a different thing that we can work with and think about here. But in thinking about the complexities, the power dynamics at play, yeah, we've got a lot to do. We need to be honest as much as we can along that process. And when operating in a context that we're not from within, I think just making sure that we are playing a role in bringing people together, but kind of getting out of the way and making those decisions, rather empower people to make decisions that will work best for that context. So yeah, that's some of my response. I'm very happy to have another chat with somebody, coffee conversation about this, to explore it. It's difficult, it's complex. But yeah, and back here on the continent, I mean, there's a lot of talent and energy and drive, and I suppose across the board, we just like give us a space in the room as well to speak and be heard. We've got a lot to contribute. So I think that there's a lot that's going to be taking place in the years to come, and to learn from each other. But thanks for the question, and hard questions are great.
Yeah, sorry for throwing that at you with a couple of minutes to answer. But yeah, I think we all need to educate and be very conscious. Got one more question from Alejandra, which I'm going to direct to Anders. So how do you convince clients to buy into innovative design ideas or solutions that aren't as commonly used in today's market? Are you making decisions on who to work with based on their sustainability values and attitudes?
Yes, so I think for many years, it's been a little bit preaching to the choir. As a studio like ours, you don't go into the open market and necessarily just pick and choose who you work with, because it takes a certain risk appetite to work in this field. More so 15 years ago than today. I mean, we know so much more today than we did also as an industry. So we're also lucky that there's a large ecosystem, both within architecture, but also design, materials policy, and so on, that are supporting this agenda. So it's a more comfortable space to work in. But as I mentioned, in terms of the scenario building in my presentation, is that, you know, we have clients that were, you know, that were part of the agenda going into a project, and we have clients that are coming into the project being very, very critical and turning around, and the other way around as well. And I think one of the main factors we use, and that is basically what is represented in what everyone is talking about today, is actually documenting what our ambition is. So we're able to measure all of our impact in terms of the social impact, in terms of scope 1, 2, and 3, in terms of each individual material, and all those decisions we're making comes with a economic cost, with a social cost, with an environmental cost. And if we're able to manage that early on in a process, we're also able to have a developing and educational conversation about it. So there's not a lot of clients for this at the moment. More are joining the chat, I want to say, but I think just to reflect a little bit on ourselves and the industry at large, our language and our understanding of what data, what financial models is needed to underpin these ambitions are also getting better, also refined. We hear from Amsterdam how very well refined the language is in terms of this, and the next scale is of course the scalability of this, and that's where we just need more. We need more clients. We need more support from everyone. But it's a touch and go. It's a case by case basis, and what we need to work with is clear documentation, clear goal setting, and then have the right data to support the decision making process.
Maybe really quickly, because I know everyone's running out of time and people need to leave. But we've had a question that 2 people have asked about how do you deal with warranties and design life of components being reused? So if we have a really quick answer, and then we can wrap up.
Very quickly. Some of the less risky material innovations we have done, the client themselves has actually taken it upon themselves to underwrite that risk. And some of the more adventurous material innovations we have done, we have actually used the backing of every university and every third-party technical university to help us in actually verifying our findings. So they are not necessarily certified, but they are third-party tested to a degree that makes them as good as certified building materials. This whole certification thing, we should almost do like a special on that one. But everything has been delivered to the site, and some of the products are, directly on the client, and some of them are just certified under normal or insured under normal insurance standards.
Thank you all for joining. I think we've learned a lot about circular cities, the whole approach of the circular economy in the different cities and regions. We've heard a lot about the value definition, and that we need to redefine the value of materials to get to a circular city. Then we also need ecosystems that are coming from a more bottom-up approach. But at the same time, we also need the top-down and like the policies around the circular cities. And one other point, which I think was quite clear, that there needs to be a clear mapping in a city, and the city needs to be aware about which materials are coming into the cities and what is going out, just to be aware about all the different materials that are there. Yeah. Thank you all for joining this panel. We hope it was interesting. And as I said, you can always come back to us with questions. You can reach out, and yeah, thanks from our side.
Yeah, thank you to all of our panelists. You guys were all amazing.